So to continue our discussion of Chapter 1 material on research, we're going to talk about first data collection and methods, and then study design. And these are two different things. So data collection, as it indicates, is about how we get information from people that we're studying, and study design is how we set up our study, how we set up the research we're doing, and that is going to have an important impact on what we can conclude from it. So we're going to start by talking about data collection, and we're going to talk about surveys, which includes questionnaires and interviews, and then observation. So we'll start there. Um, Observational research is exactly what it sounds like, that you collect information from people by watching them. And we have two different kinds of observational research. Naturalistic observation occurs in a setting that the individual or your research subjects usually occupy. So the example I have here, is observing children for aggressive behavior on a school playground. So if your research question was, for example, do boys or girls engage in more aggressive behaviors during play, you could go to a playground, you can go to the school playground, have permission, obviously. You could have research assistants who are trained to observe for objective examples of behavior, so not just aggressive behavior, which is fairly vague and subjective, but you can have a list of specific behaviors, so you can think about what behaviors might be aggressive, right? So maybe hitting, or punching, or kicking, or pushing, right? You can have a whole list, and then your research assistants have a clipboard, and they're just saying, I saw that, I saw that, I saw that. And that would be naturalistic because the children normally occupy that space. You also might do laboratory observation, which is an environment. It doesn't have to be a lab per se, but it's an environment created by the researcher. And so you might bring the children into a gymnasium that you've set up with specific toys, and you'll control how many children are in there, and how many boys, and how many girls, and what the time period is, what the time of the day is. And so it just gives you more control over variables, and we always like that. However, of course, you're going to see more natural, right, more typical behavior at the playground than you are in the place that you've set up. And so you need to decide kind of what your priorities are when you're choosing what kind of observation to do. But regardless of what kind of observation you do, you always have to worry about something called the Hawthorne effect. And the Hawthorne effect is the idea that people change their behavior when they're being observed, and that it doesn't matter, like, well, not that it doesn't matter, you don't know how they're going to change their behavior. So it may be that they are less aggressive when they're being watched, or it may be that having an observer actually stirs them up and they're more aggressive. You don't know which way it's going to be, so you can't correct for it. You just know that it's going to be different. The other thing we need to worry about is observer bias, right? That if I'm watching, my ideas about aggressive behavior might influence how I see things. Maybe my pre-existing notions about whether boys or girls are going to be more aggressive means I pay more attention to the aggressive behavior of one group and less attention to the aggressive behavior of the other, and I kind of fulfill my own prophecy about that, or my own expectations about that. Either way, though, you want to make sure we're being as objective as possible to try to get around that bias, and that goes back to what I was saying before about looking at specific behaviors rather than a category of behaviors. So observation is one way we might collect data from people, regardless of what the research design is, right? The other way that we often collect data, and this is certainly the most common way that we collect data in psychology, is through surveys. And so surveys include both questionnaires, where I give you a set of questions on paper or maybe on a computer, and I ask you to answer them for me. I also might include interviews, where instead of handing you a piece of paper, I'm asking the questions and writing them down, or inserting them into a computer form. These are the most common because they're quick, especially questionnaires are really quick. We can get lots of data from a large number of people fairly easily. But the problem is honesty here, right? When we're observing someone, it's possible they're changing their behavior, but when we're asking them, we're relying on them to tell us the truth. And that's going to, people's willingness to tell us the truth is going to vary. And then again, right, there's also that issue we talked about at the beginning of this chapter, which is even if they want to tell us the truth, they may not know. They may not have access to the information we're asking for. But that dishonesty issue often dictates whether we do questionnaires or interviews. The general rule of thumb is that if you're asking people for potentially embarrassing or just private information, that the privacy or anonymity of a questionnaire where they're writing their own answers might get you more honest answers. If they have to look at you and tell you something embarrassing during an interview, they may lie. But the other thing that happens on the flip side is that when people are filling out questionnaires, if you're asking them questions that are not private but are tedious, so that, I think I used the example, how many hours a week do I read for pleasure? If you're asking me face to face, I'm more likely, to try to figure out the answer because there's social pressure to not just kind of make up an answer while I look at you. But if you're giving me the privacy of a questionnaire, in fact, I might not work very hard at coming up with the answer, and I might just write down a number. And so if it's tedious information, sometimes interviews are a way to get the person to work harder to think about the answer. Right. So observation, interviews, questionnaires are ways we collect data from people. But we're going to spend the rest of this time talking about research design. And research design is how do we construct our research? How do we go about, deciding how many people we're going to study, what's going to happen to the people we study, is research design. And our research design really is going to determine what we can conclude. That with different research designs, you can do more or less generalizing to your population. Your conclusions, whether you can draw conclusions about causation, we're not able to draw conclusions about causation, like what causes this other thing to happen is going to depend completely on your research design. And so, so essentially whether it explains things or just describes things is going to depend on the research design. So the first research design we're going to talk about is fairly straightforward, and those are case studies. Case study is a very in-depth study of a single individual. Sometimes you'll see articles published that's a case study research where they're talking about like 3 case studies at once, but each one of those is still done independently and is, each one is a case study. So the problem with this is that if you're studying one person, there's absolutely no way for one person to represent the population, right? So you can't generalize. You can say all of this is true about this one person, but I have no idea if it's true about anybody else in the population. And so that's a real drawback, which raises the question of why would we ever do this? And the answer to that is that sometimes we settle for case studies, either because it's all we're ever going to be able to do for this research question, or because it's a first step. And so we use case studies a lot for rare conditions. So if you have a disorder that almost nobody else has, so for example, if you want to study serial killers, you're likely to do that with case studies because that's a very rare condition. Also, we use case studies when we're trying out a new treatment of some kind. And so if we just stumble across something we think might be effective, that's a new treatment, we probably would love to get that information out to other people. It worked for this one patient we tried it on. We might talk about that case and publish an article about that case. Maybe at the same time, right, we're also getting a grant and working on doing a true experiment where we can prove whether or not this treatment actually was the thing that made a difference. But that's going to take a long time to do. And so as a first step, we might publish this case study. But again, we can't generalize, and so it always has to be just a first step. So we're going to pause there, and then we're going to come back and talk about experimental research, and then in our last video, we'll talk about correlational research.